Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3 Iron and today we are going to be talking about the single most polarizing item in all of Path of Exile's history, the Headhunter. And we're going to debate the value and place of Headhunter in POE presently and maybe present a couple of different arguments about why Headhunter is great and why Headhunter is problematic for POE. Those of you who are new here to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell for more videos just like this one. If at any point in time you'd like to jump ahead or jump back and review any of our discussion points that we've hit on so far, you can of course click on any of the timestamps which are placed above my entirely bald and sunburnt forehead, and those of course are linked for you down below in the video description as well. So, Headhunter, a few disclaimers as we get started, as is always our tradition here on the G3 channel. So first off, this discussion is meant to be just that, a discussion. So none of the opinions cited are meant to be representative of absolute fact. I'm not saying that one thing is better than another. These are simply presentations of arguments and potential reasons for varying beliefs and opinions about the Headhunter leather belt, and maybe we'll touch on the inspired learning jewel as well. This is not an exhaustive discussion. We will inevitably leave out certain facets of the conversation, so be a helpful teammate and let us know what we missed out on in the comments down below to help further refine the discussion. Last disclaimer, there will be two cases presented. The case, first off, that Headhunter is good for the game in its present state, and the case that Headhunter is bad for the game in its present state. So if you're on either side of those discussion points, and maybe you want to hear the opposite side to have a debate with or to have a discussion with, that's going to be presented in our discussion presently today. So first off, Headhunter is good for POE because of its history. So POE has got some pretty iconic items, and Headhunter is at the top of that list. Headhunter is an iconic or historic item in POE's existence and ethos. So even new players or complete outsiders who don't play POE at all know the existence of Headhunter. I will get emails, Discord messages, and even PMs here on YouTube about Headhunter from players who admittedly are either first-time or second-time players of POE, have never seen a Headhunter in action, but they've heard about POE, and then therefore they've heard about Headhunter in some way or fashion. So the rarity of Headhunter, especially now in 3.7 in Legion League, as it's become more rare, the rarity has only led to the growth in its popularity both inside and outside of the POE community. And Headhunter is well known in addition to this because its applications grow with every offensive iteration of the game and with every new adaptation of monsters to the game. So Headhunter is not just iconic because, oh, look, here's an item that fits into a particular build style and maybe it'll get nerfed, maybe it'll get buffed, we don't really know. But rather, every single change that gets made to POE, whether it's an offensive change or a defensive change by adding new stats or by introducing new types of monsters, essentially is a change or a buff to Headhunter because of the way how Headhunter interacts with rare mobs and their potential for stealing mods from those rare mobs. So Headhunter is iconic, it's legendary through all of the various types and iterations of league mechanics that we've had, of introductions of different rares into the game. Headhunter has always been a chase unique item that is relevant due to the constantly changing environment and constantly changing pool of stats and available mods for it to steal. And so that makes it a very historically relevant item throughout all of POE since it was introduced in 1.0. Now, Headhunter is the archetypal chase item in POE. For those of you that want to set a goal to chase a particular item, Headhunter is probably the item that gets used for that. Headhunter really has defined what a chase item even means in Path of Exile. A lot of different games have chase items. A lot of different games have particularly top-tier items that you're building towards, or best-in-slot BIS items. But Headhunter is kind of in its own unique little category in Path of Exile's existence, where no matter what it is that you're doing, You can evaluate your entire experience throughout a league or your goals for a league by discussing the topic of Headhunter, whether or not you're pursuing one, how close you are to getting one, if you've already gotten one, what you're able to do with that Headhunter. And so many players actually will plan their entire league experience around either A, earning enough currency for a Headhunter, or B, farming a Headhunter via various methods, or C, building entire characters around the Headhunter's ability to steal rare monsters once they have the Headhunter effect. So it is the pinnacle and the defining chase item in PoE, not just presently, but also throughout the course of history in PoE. Headhunter's rarity, which again, it's been made more rare during 3.7 Legion League. Its rarity makes it, kind of a forbidden fruit of PoE. So there's always that psychological aspect of, hey, you can't have this. It's very rare. It's very far off. It's the get your hands caught in the cookie jar proverbial cliche, as it were, where, hey, here's something that you can't have. And because you can't have it, that alone makes it more desirable. Right? So every player virtually every player uses a Headhunter as essentially a measuring stick for where they're at in their progress throughout the league. And Headhunter has even become an expression. It's become, really a word that has multiple different uses. It can be used as a verb. It can be used as an adjective, a noun. I've even heard it used as an expletive in our Discord. Headhunter is... I don't think it's stating the case really too far to say that Headhunter is so many things of what the good things about PoE are. That it's unique, that it's chase-worthy, that it gives you something to build towards, that once you have it, it's build-enabling, that it allows for replayability, and really that it's also economic in value, right? Which is what a lot of people complain about, is that it's so expensive or that it's so rare. And so this is part of what makes it so iconic because of its history. It's so rare, it is iconic, which is really, really cool if you're interested in a Headhunter. Well, more reasons why Headhunter is good for PoE. So beyond its history is simply because it's fun, dare I say it, that, we're playing a video game and we can have fun. By the way, last disclaimer, if we could have a fourth disclaimer, do whatever is fun, okay? So if having a Headhunter for you is fun, go do that. If not having a Headhunter for you is fun, okay, then don't go get one. But have fun, right? We're playing video games here. So Headhunter is fun because it's wildly unpredictable. So the mods that you steal are completely dependent on the rares in the area that you're presently playing in. You won't be able to predict all of the stats that you'll gain from a particular zone, which means you'll give up the consistency of another belt. Let's say you've got another belt that gives you life, that gives you resistances, that maybe gives you increased elemental damage, that gives you increased attack damage, increased anything, right? Increased global physical damage. You sacrifice those things when you slot in a Headhunter leather belt. You're essentially offering up your belt slot for this unpredictable and wild chase item. But in exchange for the predictability of another belt, you get PoE's version of Pandora's box that just opens up, and you won't be able to predict all of the things that you're going to steal, but you're going to steal things from the rares that you encounter. And so that is a really fun, and essentially it creates a story for you every single zone that you enter into, where you can go, oh yeah, I entered this one particular map. I was farming a tier 16 or a tier 15, and I went in and I killed these two mobs, and I got these two really, really interesting stats that were on the rare mobs that were there. And then all of a sudden it changed my build, and it had this really interesting interaction. That creates a story, right? Headhunter creates these stories where players can go into zones, think their build is designed to do one thing, and then all of a sudden find out that their build can do this entirely other thing if they change up some of the stats and they steal some stats from some of the monsters that are there. That's really cool. That creates a fun experience that's unpredictable, and so you never know when you're entering into a new zone what's going to happen. And many of us that are crafters in Path of Exile experience this kind of fun when we're crafting, because you never know what you're going to hit. You try to mitigate the amount of RNG that you're going to have when you're crafting in order to hit certain things. But generally speaking, there's still some aspect of RNG, and we love that. We as gamers love that. We love that whether or not we're playing a randomized card game. We love that whether or not we're gambling or spending or crafting or currency in PoE. We love that aspect of unpredictability that can create a story for us that is either positive or negative, but it creates a story that we can share with other people. So Headhunter is wildly unpredictable, and that's fun. Headhunter's unpredictability gives each and every area a flavor and replayability factor that makes each encounter with a Headhunter slightly different. And that's really, really cool. How often is it that you can go into a particular zone and have your build be the thing that's different? Typically in POE, when you enter into a zone, it's the zone that's different, right? Your build is the consistent thing that you have worked on, that you have crafted, that you've theorized about. Your build is the constant factor, whereas the zone is the unconstant factor that you're constantly trying to challenge yourself with and overcome. But what Headhunter does is it adds on a layer of unpredictability where your character that was consistent now also gains some inconsistency, and that adds replayability to playing a character that's got a Headhunter leather belt equipped, and that's really, really fun. Headhunter also scales with investment. So it's fun because the more currency you have, essentially, sky's the limit. You can just keep dumping currency into a character. The more rares that there are in a zone, the more mods and refreshing of mods you will have. So not only does this mean that you can scale your currency onto your character's items, onto your character's passive tree, onto your character's ascendancy, onto your character's rolls on stats, whether that be jewels, whether that be items, whether that be rares or other uniques that you've got equipped. Headhunter scales with investment on maps as well, because the more rares you can generate in a zone, the more item quantity, the more pack size that you can generate in a zone, the better Headhunter gets. So yes, Headhunter is an incredibly expensive item, but it also scales with that expense. So as you are killing things more quickly, you're garnering more wealth, which then you can spend more wealth, which then you can kill more things, which then, okay, you're starting to see the cycle that we're getting into, and that's really, really fun. Headhunter provides an outlet for builds that are the very definition of build defining unique. Like when you equip a Headhunter, it can carry so many builds that would otherwise be suboptimal simply by killing a couple of rares in a map, and then that gets you going and you take off. It actually opens up creative combinations for content that would otherwise be futile if you didn't have the ability to steal stats and to steal mods. Now, of course, there are some prophecies that you can do this with. Of course, there's the inspired learning unique jewel. That's kind of like the mini Headhunter that you can do this with, which is great. It's a great thing to experiment and to try and test out to see, okay, what's the breakpoint for my build to actually work in a tier 16 map or in a tier 15 map, right? Do I need to get an inspired learning and just stealing 1 or 2 stats at a time is fine for my build? Or do I need to get a Headhunter? Or what are the speed differences in between just using 1 or 2 inspired learnings versus using a Headhunter, and how much quicker I can go? Is it worth that initial investment? And then will that investment pay off as it carries me through endgame content or through highly invested maps and highly invested content? It's really cool to see, and I've seen dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. I don't want to say hundreds, I think that's hyperbolic, but I've seen dozens of different builds that have used Headhunters, and so many players look at a build guide that includes Headhunters and just goes, oh, this is a terrible build guide, I don't want to look at it, I don't want to see it. Oh, what kind of POE player are you that you build around a Headhunter? Who gets a Headhunter? Well, some players like to chase this item, put their entire efforts of a league towards getting this item, and then try out different builds with this item. And so that's really, really cool to see how many different builds open up because of the Headhunter, because of the different things that you can steal off of rare monsters. And so that's really, really fun. At least that's one argument for the Headhunter. Okay, we're going to take a brief intermission. I'm going to take a sip of coffee, and then we're going to present the other side of the case, why Headhunter is bad for PoE.
One coffee drink a little.
Okay, so Headhunter is bad for PoE, first off, because of speed, right? So Headhunter is bad because of speed. Headhunter creates a massive disparity between the people who have a Headhunter and the people who do not have a Headhunter. So players who have a Headhunter are able to take on content that is much more rewarding due to more rares, which rare monsters, for those of you who are new or are unaware, rare monsters simply have scaling much more XP than magic monsters. So yellow monsters have more XP than blue monsters, which have more XP than white monsters, otherwise known as normal monsters. So rare monsters are the best in terms of XP, and they also have got the best rewards in terms of item drops, right? So if you're a Headhunter build that is built to scale around encountering rares, and you're able to dump currency into your build to generate more rares per zone, and you're able to go through those zones faster you can see how this is a problem. Essentially, people who have a headhunter who can go really, really fast through these zones and invest currency heavily into these zones are going to create a bigger gap between people who have a headhunter and people who don't have a headhunter, and this is perceived as a problem. Players who do not have a headhunter are thus at a disadvantage in any zones that have rares, as almost any single build in the game would simply go through that exact same zone, that exact same content at a quicker rate. Now, one of the reasons why I'm using maps as so much of an example for this entire discussion is because, of course, Headhunter isn't necessarily the greatest bossing item in the game unless you're encountering a boss that is in a particular zone where you've already stolen a bunch of rare mobs, right? If you've already stolen a bunch of rare mob stats and then you can simply go rush the boss, then yes, Headhunter is a great item, which of course in Path of Exile Legion for monolith encounters as well as for the Timeless Fight encounters, all of those bosses are taking place inside zones where you're killing rares and stacking up those rare stats on your character and then killing the boss. So again, players who don't have a Headhunter are simply at a disadvantage when there are rare mobs present. And so, of course, this encapsulates our entire discussion and the entire present climate of the discussion of Headhunter right now during Path of Exile Legion League, because there's so many bosses to kill and so many rares present in the timeless conflicts that if you don't have a Headhunter, it feels bad in comparison, and there's nowhere near chances for you to scale up your rewards in those exact same zones without a Headhunter as though if you did have a Headhunter. So speed, as the cliche goes, kills. And in this case, it kills and it bites not to have a Headhunter. So Headhunter doesn't create interesting choices around player agency, and so it's bad. It really doesn't create any kind of player choices in terms of, should I use this, when should I use it, when should I not use it, is it an activatable like a flask where I need to manage it in any sort of way? The only choice involved with a Headhunter is, can I incorporate this into my build? Which the answer is yes. You can give up your belt slot unless you're using a unique that enables the rest of your build. Let's say, for instance, like the Coward's Chain Legacy belt, which, curses you with vulnerability and then it counts you as being on low life while you're cursed with vulnerability. Okay, that's build enabling for somebody that wants to use Pain Attunement. So that's essentially a 30% more multiplier, right? Which that's great. That's great. But is it possible that if you simply swapped out that chain, that's a build enabling chain, if you swapped that out for, let's say, a Headhunter, would you get more than 30% increased damage, right? Or 30% more damage. It's a more multiplier, not an increase. But anyway, would you get 30% more from a Headhunter than from a Coward's Chain? Yes, the answer is yes. So after equipping the item, after the simple choice of, should I equip Headhunter? Yes. After that, the item has zero downsides, drawbacks, or challenges for builds. It really doesn't. And those of you that might say, oh, well, there are some challenges for Headhunter depending on the stats that you steal, or for Inspired Learning depending on the stats that you steal, like Shroudwalker, for instance. Yeah, there are some stats that are annoying. It's not enough to say, okay, this item is not worth its risk. It is not a sufficient downside to say, oh, this enables player agency and I need to make a serious decision, a serious weighted decision to encounter or not to encounter with this particular belt or this particular item equipped, whether that be Inspired Learning or a Headhunter. It's simply not a sufficient enough downside to say, yes, I really need to stop and think about this, about whether or not I should use it. The answer is no. The answer is you shouldn't stop to think about it. You simply should equip it because you're going to go faster. You're going to kill more rare monsters. And this is bad. This is bad, right? None of us like a lack of player agency. None of us like that. None of us enjoy playing games and say, oh, by the way, I would like to not think about this or not interact with this in any sort of meaningful way. So if you could just do that for me and I'll just sit here passively. Like, that's why many of us play games and don't watch movies. Like, movies and TV is a passive form of entertainment, whereas games are an active form of entertainment. We like player agency. Player agency is one of the things that differentiates our hobby, gaming, from so many other hobbies that are maybe more passive, right? Even reading. Reading is a wonderful active hobby where you're using your own eyes and your own imagination in order to read and interact with a book. And yet, it's still relatively passive. You're not choosing how to develop that story, whereas when you're playing a game, in many ways, you are choosing to develop the story of your character, in Path of Exile's case, whether that's your choices on your passive tree, your choices for your itemization. These are all choices, player agency. And Headhunter simply removes player agency. It just says, hey, do you have a Headhunter? You probably should be using it because you'll make more currency. Headhunter doesn't interact with the passive tree, ascendancy, or other items in any sort of significant way, except for maybe inspired learning. Headhunter interacts with the number of rares that are available in a given zone. There's nothing for a player to do to choose when a buff goes off or is stolen. You simply choose more speed to acquire more stats quicker. That's what Headhunter does, and that's bad. The speed of it, the lack of player agency, the way how it's uninteractive, all of these things are bad, are arguments for why Headhunter is bad. Moving on, a couple more arguments for why Headhunter is bad. It's bad because of design. It really limits the design choices of grinding gear games. So Headhunter restricts the choices that GGG could potentially make. Any buffs or increased presence of rares in a particular zone, maybe due to the league mechanic or changes to core gameplay, all of those are instant buffs to Headhunter, right? If you add more rares into a particular leveling zone, into a particular map, into a particular setting, into a particular tile set, it's a buff to a Headhunter. Whether you meant for it to be a buff to Headhunter or not, it doesn't matter. GGG over the last year has displayed that anything that will mess with max resistances due to the restrictions of design choices that they're able to make is getting killed. So we saw things like Lore Weave, we saw things like max resistance flasks, we saw other mechanisms for increasing your cap on max resistances. All of those things over the last year got nerfed. And the reason for it that GGG has stated is because it was limiting design choices. It was limiting what they could give us as players and what decisions they could offer for us to encounter with various content, league mechanics, item design choices, passive tree updates, etc. It was a limiting factor for what was going on and what was going into Path of Exile. And there is nothing that is more limiting and restricting, at least in terms of designing rares, than Headhunter and Inspired Learning. These two things restrict the type of mods that GGG could add onto rares due to the possibility of Headhunter or Inspired Learning stealing these types of new mods. So any and all new modifications to rares have to take place with Headhunter in mind. And that's got to be a pain in the butt to deal with for GGG as a design team. And in the past, they've shown that anything that restricts their design choices is up on the chopping block, right? So the fact that if you want to argue that Headhunter is bad for POE, make an appeal that it's bad for design, right? Because it's tougher to design around and it essentially kills the creativity of the people who are giving us this very creative outlet for our hobby for gaming through Path of Exile. Headhunter also breaks the mold of the upside and downside unique design. So those of you who don't know, many, if not most, uniques in PoE are designed with both an upside and a downside in mind. Many times when you look at a piece of unique gear in Path of Exile, you'll look at it and you'll go, oh, I really want that stat. What is that stat? Why is that stat on there? That stat's terrible. Stat A looks amazing and build enabling, but stat B looks like a pile of steaming dog poo. Like, what's the point of putting these two things together? That's the point of putting those two things together, is to create that cognitive dissonance that you are now experiencing where you're going, I want this, but I don't want that. That precise weighing of options is exactly what has made PoE unique design so flavorful and so interactive and build enabling, right? Because it allows for a wide amount of positives to be thrown onto uniques, but also a diverse set of potential negatives. Sometimes those negatives are turned into positives through different combinations of different uniques that take advantage of these things. So with PoE unique design being the way how it is, many uniques being designed with this sort of balance in mind, things get nerfed around these things. So if a unique doesn't have sufficient downsides, or if it's simply becoming the meta because it really is strictly better than everything else, then it oftentimes gets nerfed. That's what it's done over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, etc. If something simply becomes dominant because it's dominant and because it is strictly better and the downsides are not downsidey enough, if they're not negative enough, then GGG typically goes in and makes a mechanical change. So some examples of this would be Poet's Pen, would be Impulsas, would be Shroud of the Lightless. There's many, many more. On the passive tree, we could look at Vol Pact. There's many, 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 many more choices that we could look at that have come up on the nerf chopping block by GGG because they have limiting design factors, and they break the unique design of either the passive tree or the unique item in and of itself. Headhunter has not been changed, except for bug fixes, since being introduced in 1.0. So those of you that want to make an argument that Headhunter is bad for POE because of its design, you can argue that there is a ton of stuff that has changed in Path of Exile since 1.0, and Headhunter hasn't changed to account for that. This is really, really bad design, and it's probably limiting the design choices of the team at GGG, and it's not reflecting the core philosophy design principles of GGG in making certain things that are uniques have upside and downside. There is no downside to Headhunter, and so that in and of itself is a downside from a design perspective. Okay, some concluding counterpoints. First off, those of you who are saying Headhunter isn't the problem at the moment, think about this. The amount of rares within monolith encounters and the timeless conflict battles are the reason for the power spike of Headhunter. So in other words, you're articulating Headhunter isn't the problem at the moment during Path of Exile Legion League, and the reason is because there's all these rares that are present due to Legion League. Therefore, as soon as Legion League exits the door, whether it goes core and is therefore just less available, it's still present but less available than it is now, that in and of itself is going to change the power level of Headhunter. So because Headhunter scales with rares, an abnormally high amount of rares present during Legion League has simply inflated Headhunter's value and thereby its hate from some in the community. Counterpoint number 2. So, for those of you saying that Headhunter is the problem because it now creates a limiting factor for GGG in game design around future zones, encounters, and league mechanics, any league that is presently being designed or that is designed or that has been designed with higher amounts of rares in mind will result in this massive disparity between the players who possess a Headhunter and the players who do not. Simply the presence of rares, right? This is now a problem for Headhunter, not just for Legion League. So those are two concluding counterpoints on either side representing whether or not Headhunter is good or whether or not Headhunter in its present state is bad for POE. Well, thanks so much for watching and for participating in our discussion today. What are your thoughts about Headhunter? I would love to read and interact with your thoughts down below in the comments. Do you think that Headhunter needs a nerf or a change? And if not, why would you leave Headhunter the way it is presently? Are any of these arguments convincing? Or maybe you've got your own arguments and your own reasons of why you would change or wouldn't change Headhunter. Leave us a comment down below to let us know what your own thoughts, opinions, and arguments are, and of course we will do our best to respond and get back to each and every one of those comments. Thanks again so much for watching, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra? Nah, how about a Headhunter? How about if today is the day a Headhunter drops for you during Path of Exile 3.7 Legion League? Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.